Hello. Thank you for taking the time today to attend this talk, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Pushing Illegibility in Typographic Trends. My name is Amy Fang. I'm currently a designer working in Brooklyn, New York. While my commercial practice is primarily in type-driven brand identities and editorial design, my personal research lies in uncovering how type drives culture and vice versa. To preface today's talk, early in my graphic design career and education, I became obsessed with experimental typography and its uses in contemporary pop culture as well as conceptual design. When I'm talking experimental typography, I'm talking about visual trends I've noticed as of late within acid graphics, 3D design, and rave flyer-inspired designs. Trends that emerge most often in music, in fashion, and underground scenes. I saw people designing graphics to be almost incomprehensible to readers, completely throwing away adherence to grids and structures, creating elongated, jagged text, and melted psychedelic bubbles for head-achingly complex lettering projects. Because my exposure to this trend has largely been through social media, a place that seems to proliferate anyways, I've always considered it through the lens of aesthetics, never critically. But, as with all design, these works and methodologies don't exist in a bubble. They live to reflect the world around us. This talk is an abridged version of a project I embarked on towards the end of my design education, where I decided I wanted to analyze a style of typography designed to be illegible, that is more about gesture and expression than communication from designer to reader. Aesthetic pleasure is not of high importance here. Instead, visually jarring compositions rebel against commercial design and the mainstream, melting together mediums and styles that are hard to define in concrete terms. So what do we call or attempt to categorize this mode of creation? Is it brutalist graphic design, acid graphics? As my mentor behind this project, Henry Lucas, fondly called it, graphic vomit. I determined key questions to drive this conversation. What exactly constitutes and challenges legibility? And what drives other designers of my generation to create works that have quite the opposite of meaning? And through this exploration, ended up creating an informal design thesis around this topic, with a written essay dividing the usage of illegibility in typography into 4 chapters: experimental typography as image, as identity, as protest, and as being. Out of these sections, today we will be discussing experimental typography as image making and as a mode of protest specifically, through looking at certain case studies of illegible typography within these categories. To take it back a little bit, in design school, like most everyone else, I was trained to consider Swiss typography as the purest, most rational form of design. We're talking all Helvetica, all modernism, upholding grid systems strictly. And of course, with all that, good typography was often synonymous with what was legible. This type of thinking is further impressed upon us as students by learning of classic designers such as Massimo Vignelli, who, as a true modernist, believed in utmost simplicity. And for those of you who don't know Vignelli's work, he is most well known for doing the identity systems for American Airlines and for the New York subway system, so both of these depended highly on legibility. He saw typography as a discipline to organize information in the most objective way possible, and for him, typography was not intended as an expression of the self or as a pretext for pictorial exercises, and the image from this monograph of his depicts how famously, or one could say infamously, he believed one's arsenal of typefaces should not exceed 5, and he outlined these 5 as Garamond, Bodoni, Century Expanded, Frittura, Times Roman, and of course, Helvetica. He even went so far as to say the advent of the computer generated the phenomena called desktop publishing. This enabled anyone who could type the freedom of using any available typeface and do any kind of distortion. It was a disaster of mega proportions. The computer allowed anybody to design new typefaces, and that became one of the biggest visual pollution of all times. As I learned more about these views towards typography and upholding purity and simplicity, I wondered, have we developed new attitudes towards what was considered good and what is considered bad typography? Because even before Vignelli's time, this was the dominant attitude. Beatrice Ward's 1932 essay, The Crystal Goblet, provides the analogy of typography functioning as crystal to act as a carrier without any obstruction. But online, I was seeing a completely, what I thought was a very new aesthetic of typography within graphic design, in which designers my age seemed to throw caution to the wind, in which, amidst the age-old debate of form over function, maybe form has been having its moment. This brings me to the first section, Typography as Image, in which I began to look at works created by the likes of Jacob Wise, Brando Corradini, David Rudnick, Braulio Amato, etc. And I would just like to throw in a disclaimer here that, unfortunately, in this movement, it is dominated by predominantly white male designers. But in their works, I saw prevalent similarities. I saw bold display typefaces, hybrid combinations of organic forms within digital aesthetics, the way type transcended its form as a linguistic message. I additionally saw that typography had the power to take on meaning through form alone, similar to an icon or an image. In going back to that original question, what constitutes and what challenges meaning, we will have to look at two examples of lettering created by Jacob Wise and Brando Corradini. And in doing so, we may come a little bit closer to defining illegibility through the context of giving visual meaning. Jacob Wise's album cover design for the musician Reckon Wrong provides a perfect example. Letterings which form the words Paris is melting, twist and curl into ornament, into pattern, breathing vitality and life into these words. About creating the design, Wise says, legibility was secondary to its function as an artifact of graphic interest, which played directly into the bizarre and curious nature of Reckon Wrong's music. Thus, the meaning of the written word here is secondary to the context derived from its typographic form. The lettering's natural plant-like forms reference the Art Nouveau style from the early 1900s to 1920s. This allusion imbues a feeling of classical French beauty in his typography, which still integrates contemporary culture as its warping also pays homage to the current European rave scene. Because of these inferences made only by looking at the letter forms, Wise has used imagery over legibility to create meaning that's found underneath the surface. Art Nouveau here meets rave culture, successfully encapsulating the idea that Paris is melting, whether you can read those words or not. So Wise's work prioritizes form over function, conceptuality over functionality, a prerogative young designers are heeding more and more lately. The words do not need to be read, at least in the traditional sense of interpreting them letter by letter. Designers like Wise are questioning what makes a word legible and also illegible, since typography can be read and processed on two different levels, one as a word and secondly as image. Similarly, type becomes imagery, or to be more specific, it becomes pattern in a typeface by Brando Corradini. So this typeface, its name deformity alludes to its aesthetics, curves interrupted by sharp and jagged points with very little uniformity amongst the deformed letters. Each letter is so estranged from what it usually looks like, so much so that at first glance it's not clear that you are looking at typography instead of just maybe pure geometry. I included deformity as one of my case studies because it just simply has amazing ability to act as pure ornament. Its strength is that it can stand as form alone without needing to explicitly carry a legible message to have an impact on us as a viewer, as a reader. Additionally, I feel that deformity challenges the viewer more than Wise's lettering. Corradini's typeface forces its audience to consider these deformities as works of elegance as well. And through these two case studies, I'd like to make the argument that designs can never be truly divorced from semantics. Wise portrays a sort of sensual psychedelia through his letter forms, while Corradini creates jagged patterns full of rebellion. When analyzing their works, I have used their forms rather than their functions to inform myself about their underlying messages. Both works show that if type cannot be read in the traditional sense, meaning is made and unmade in a subjective manner. Even if a design is illegible to some, we find messages through semiotics and context, through our own inferences and interpretations. However, even as we consider how meaning can always be derived from a design based off of the viewer's own interpretation, there is still the question of why. Why would a designer actively obscure the legibility of their work? So my first thinking was, obviously, is it a reaction against Swiss design, a form of protest? And in design history, rationality in design thinking was followed by modernism, a reaction to the establishment of high modernism. Initially, at that time, many designers thought it was just undisciplined self-indulgence, a hodgepodge of styles with no unifying ideals or formal vocabularies dreamed up by students. One could describe the shift as a younger generation of designers simply indulging their egos and refusing to be transparent, like a crystal goblet. Or you could say they were acknowledging their unique position in the culture, one that could have any numbers of political or ideological agendas. And this was written by Keaty in the article Graphic Design in the Postmodern Era. And so the postmodern era of graphic design was driven forward by young students, forming a counter to the previous movement of modernism. Whether or not we're still in this era is debatable, but similarly today, our new emerging aesthetics of graphic design are being pushed by our youth. And through acts of critical subversion or speculative works, I wanted to use those works to uncover the formation of defiance in illegible graphic design. I wanted to examine how the chosen case studies acted as protest on two levels, critiquing an issue while rebelling against design norms as a work of illegibility. Anya Kaiser's Sex Realities, To Whom Do I Owe My Body does exactly that. It's a deluge of graphics to overwhelm the senses. With this project, we are introduced to the movement of acid graphics, which Kaiser doesn't personally identify with, but her design aesthetic may say otherwise. Before we dive specifically into Kaiser's work, we must first consider the implications of the acid graphic movement itself. Even though the trend as we know it is recent, its roots are in the late 80s and 90s, when rave flyers and drug use proliferated and a reaction against the canon of modernist good design formulated, an anti-design aesthetic emerged. This design aesthetic combined loud typography with digital techniques. It incorporated motifs and graphics relating to raves, psychedelia, utopias. And even while similarly taking on a style that resists typographic hierarchy and embraces maximalism, Kaiser approaches these trends conceptually. Rather than only thinking about style, she utilizes an inundation of graphics and a rendering of illegible meaning to make statements about shifting power dynamics and hegemonic structures. About the term acid, Kaiser has said, I imagine acid could also apply to subjective and emotional strategies like elaborating on visual dissonances, messiness, and coexistence. Eurocentric graphic design is loaded with dominant imperatives like the desirability of simplicity and clarity, which are so often tied to modernism. So overall, she considers how acid tactics become a visual tool to challenge both heteronormative concepts and rigid industry standard aesthetics. As a designer, Kaiser aims to unravel dominant narratives. In both its aesthetics and in its concepts, this project Sex Realities aims to do so as well. Sex Realities is a feminist/queer investigation into different realities surrounding our beings and how these identities are produced and rendered. The resulting body of work includes not just a printed book, but also writings, a website, GIFs, if that's how you want to say it, and even a line of beach towels. With her writing, Kaiser investigates different ways in which existing ideals are projected onto bodies, both online and offline, in the corporate world and in pop culture. And if we are to take this trend of illegible typography at face value, it may seem simply that designers participating within this canon are only just fully engaging with experimentation, pushing the bounds of what graphic design can be. I will caution against letting illegible typography simply exist as empty vessels for aesthetic personal expression. Just because these works are experimental does not mean they cannot carry important messages. Designers like Anya Kaiser are appropriating this movement to craft conceptual critiques of the society we exist within, and perhaps in a generation of designers who find themselves as disillusioned by the world as ever, it makes sense to fight nonsense with nonsense. Although we don't have that much time today to dive into other works that explore illegibility as protest, works such as Anya Kaiser's Design Illegibility show how visual nonsense can act as heady rebellion to graphic design norms. More than just thinking of these trends as protesting against the rigidity of modernism, however, we should consider design illegibility to be central to the progression of graphic design and central to the identities of young graphic designers today. More than putting these works into the binaries of good versus bad, aesthetic versus ugly, we should consider how these trends are redefining visual culture and, in a way, reflecting modes of change within our society. Our identities as young designers are reflected in these works, and in these past several years amidst a global pandemic with civil unrest spiraling throughout nations and an impending future of uncertainty, I'm curious to see how this trend of illegibility will evolve alongside us. In regards to the formation of identity through design philosophies, Michael Rock declares, "We are intimately, physically connected to the work we produce. It is inevitable that our work bears our stamp, and in this way we build a body of work, and from that body of work emerges a singular message, maybe even what it feels like to be living now." So there are some designers out there who may disagree with me in considering these current trends as proper typographic design. Yet all three works I've spoken about today show that there is a differentiation between illegibility as just simply poor design and illegibility as an effective means to create imagery. It is so easy to create unintentional illegibility out of bad typography or a confusing layout. On the other hand, it takes skill to make something so wonderfully indecipherable that the audience is instead challenged to rely on other things, to coax meanings out of a word through its forms and its semiotics rather than just reading its letters. Maybe that is what I love so much about this design trend. It challenges the viewer to take a moment to pause and to take a closer look. These works stunt the traditional ways of reading so as to make way for new perceptions. From these moments of illegibility spring the most exciting results, ones which will define this period of time within graphic design. I, for one, am excited to see what we make of these ever-evolving methods of typographic expression, and I hope you are too. Thank you once again for coming today, and if you have any questions, let me know.